Thomas Reed had power, Sarah Collins had charm, and Elaine Reed had no idea their secret would end in murder. This is the chilling story of a successful CEO, his ambitious secretary, and the wife caught in a deadly love triangle. What began as a hidden affair spiraled into a manipulative game of lies, betrayal, and ultimately death. As passion turned into obsession and ambition turned into a weapon, one question remained unanswered. Who really planned the kill? Thomas Reed had everything most people only dreamed of. He owned a multi-million-dollar real estate firm in downtown Chicago, was married to a respected art curator, and had two healthy children enrolled in elite private schools. He drove a black Porsche, wore Italian suits tailored to perfection, and lived in a mansion tucked behind iron gates. At first glance, his life was flawless. But the closer you looked, the more it began to unravel. Behind the carefully staged photographs and polished reputation was a man worn thin by years of chasing success. Thomas had spent so much time building his empire that he hadn't noticed how far he had drifted from his wife, Elaine. Their conversations had turned into silent dinners. Their connection, once electric, was now routine. They slept in the same bed but existed in different worlds. Work had become his refuge. The office was where he felt in control, where his decisions mattered, and where no one questioned him. It was during one of those late afternoons when resumes were piling up on his desk and fatigue hung heavy in the air that Sarah Collins walked into his life. She was interviewing for a secretary position, nothing high-ranking, just someone to manage his schedule and calls. But her presence commanded attention. She was poised but approachable, ambitious yet not overbearing. Thomas barely glanced at the other candidates. He offered her the job on the spot. Sarah accepted without hesitation. She began the following Monday, dressed in quiet confidence. At first, things were professional. She kept his meetings in order, filtered his calls with precision, and even learned his habits, like how he preferred his coffee and which clients he wanted to avoid. But as weeks passed, a subtle shift occurred. She stayed a bit later than the others. Her jokes became personal, her compliments more frequent. Thomas didn't stop her. In fact, he welcomed it. It started innocently enough, a laugh shared over a missed meeting, casual conversations during lunch breaks. But there was an unspoken pull between them, growing stronger by the day. The energy between them was impossible to ignore. When the first kiss happened, it didn't feel like a mistake. It felt like something long overdue. They began meeting secretly, under the radar of the office staff. Weekend trips were masked as conferences. Business dinners turned into romantic evenings. Thomas told himself it was temporary, a harmless distraction. But that lie unraveled quickly. He started making real promises to Sarah, whispered dreams of divorcing Elaine and starting fresh, just the two of them. He believed what he said, or at least he wanted to. Thomas didn't know that Sarah had heard those kinds of promises before. She didn't just want affection. She wanted a future. And for her, that future had no space for Elaine. While Thomas was juggling the double life, Elaine was beginning to notice the changes. Her husband was always distracted, always busy. He wasn't present during family dinners, and the warmth in his eyes had cooled. He had excuses ready for everything, trips, meetings, phone calls late at night. She had lived long enough with him to know the signs. She chose not to confront him right away. She watched instead. Back at the office, Sarah's confidence was turning into control. She began stepping into meetings she wasn't invited to. She offered suggestions on deals she wasn't qualified to assess. Thomas, blinded by desire, allowed it. He even gave her more responsibility, letting her handle sensitive documents and oversee staff communications. His colleagues raised eyebrows, but none of them dared speak up. He started funneling money to her bank account, paying for her rent in a high-rise overlooking the lake, covering her travel expenses, and buying her expensive gifts. It was no longer an affair, it was a second life. And second lives, as Thomas was about to learn, rarely end well. Sarah had begun to expect more attention, more power, more control. She hinted at moving into the spotlight, no longer wanting to hide in the shadows. She spoke of a future where she wasn't just the secretary, but the woman by his side. Thomas hesitated. He still hadn't told Elaine. Every time he tried, he backed out, guilt crept in. So did fear. But Sarah was growing impatient. She knew he was stalling. Her tone changed, her messages became colder, more demanding. She had invested months into this relationship, and she wasn't about to be discarded like the others before her. Thomas tried to regain control. He suggested a break, time to figure things out. That decision would cost him more than he imagined, because Sarah had been planning for this moment. She had access to his records, knew his routines, and most importantly, understood how to hurt him where it counted most. And still, he didn't see it coming. As far as Thomas was concerned, he was simply a man in love with the wrong woman at the wrong time. What he didn't know was that the woman he thought he knew was capable of more than manipulation. She was capable of destruction. And soon everything he had built, his career, his family, his freedom, would be caught in the storm that Sarah Collins had quietly prepared. Elaine Reed had always trusted her instincts. Over the years, she had learned to read the quiet shifts in tone, the subtle movements, the energy that changed in a room when something wasn't right. She had spent more than a decade by Thomas's side, watching him transform from a hungry young real estate broker into a polished executive. She had seen the late nights before major deals and knew the stress that came with chasing success. But this time, something felt different. Thomas had grown colder, distant in a way that couldn't be blamed on work. He avoided eye contact, mumbled excuses, and clutched his phone tighter than usual. He had always been busy, but now he was unavailable. And it wasn't just emotional distance, his habits changed. Credit card charges appeared from places they had never visited, hotels and restaurants in areas where they didn't socialize. There were weekends he claimed to be at out-of-town conferences, but when she checked the company's calendar, nothing was scheduled. Elaine didn't shout, she didn't beg, she watched. She recorded small details in a notebook she kept hidden in her closet. Times, names, phone numbers, anything that seemed off. Still, she needed proof, something that could turn her gut feeling into fact. She contacted David Langley, a private investigator who had once worked in homicide. He was discreet and efficient, and within 2 weeks he handed her a manila folder thick with evidence. Inside were photographs of Thomas and a woman she didn't recognize, Sarah Collins. They were captured walking hand in hand into a boutique hotel, laughing over a candlelit dinner and embracing in parking lots. Elaine flipped through the pages, emotionless. It wasn't shock, it wasn't heartbreak, it was confirmation. The woman was younger, blonde, and stylish in a calculated way. Not overly glamorous, but just polished enough to draw attention. Elaine studied her face. It wasn't just the betrayal that unsettled her. It was the familiarity in Sarah's expression. She didn't look like someone being seduced. She looked like someone in control. Elaine started digging into Sarah's background. She called in favors, quietly searched records, and asked questions among her network of art collectors, lawyers, and socialites. What she found raised more questions than answers. Sarah had no listed family members. Her resume was thin, mostly temporary jobs, and she moved frequently, never staying at one job longer than a year. There was a juvenile record, but it had been sealed. Some old neighbors described her as quiet but intense. One said she had a history of making people uncomfortable and left town suddenly after an incident no one wanted to talk about. There was nothing solid, no smoking gun, just whispers and shadows. But to Elaine that was enough. She knew this wasn't just a fling. Sarah had an agenda. And Thomas, in all his confidence, couldn't see it. Meanwhile, Sarah was settling deeper into her role at the company. She walked the halls with a sense of ownership. Her desk, once tucked near reception, had been moved closer to Thomas's office. She attended meetings she had no business being in, and no one dared question it. The staff noticed, but fear kept them silent. Thomas had become unpredictable, quick to defend her and dismiss others. Sarah started signing off on small financial decisions, accessing files that were once restricted. Thomas gave her permission, convinced she was simply being proactive. But Elaine knew better. She could feel the slow unraveling. Sarah wasn't building a relationship, she was positioning herself for takeover. Elaine had options. She had already contacted a divorce attorney and began separating her assets. She opened new accounts in her name, documented financial transfers, and ensured the children's trust funds were protected. but she didn't file the papers yet. Something told her to wait. It wasn't just about revenge or humiliation, it was about safety. Sarah had noticed Elaine watching her. In the few times they crossed paths, charity galas, corporate events, there was a cold recognition between them. Sarah smiled, but her eyes held something sharper, something territorial. Elaine had dealt with jealousy before. This wasn't that. This was something else, something darker. Then small things began happening. Elaine received a strange anonymous email accusing her of cheating. Her assistant got a call from someone pretending to be a reporter, fishing for gossip. A bouquet of black roses was delivered to her office with no note. The messages were clear. Someone wanted her rattled. Elaine reported nothing. She continued her routine, never showing fear, never giving Sarah the reaction she wanted. But inside she became more alert. She kept her phone location on at all times, updated security systems at home, and started carrying a small recorder in her purse. She wasn't sure what was coming, but she was certain the danger wasn't just emotional anymore. It was creeping closer, becoming physical, becoming real. The affair wasn't the story anymore. The story was something deeper, a power struggle disguised as love, a quiet war brewing beneath designer suits and office doors. Elaine wasn't just fighting to keep her dignity. She was preparing to protect her life. And the most terrifying part? No one around Thomas seemed to notice that the woman he had let into his world wasn't just a mistress. She was a threat. One that wouldn't leave without a fight. Thomas believed he could manage everything. His marriage, his business, and his affair all existed in separate compartments inside his mind, neatly organized and carefully shielded from one another. But reality rarely cooperates with fantasy. The moment he promoted Sarah to executive assistant, the line between personal indulgence and professional chaos began to blur beyond repair. The promotion seemed harmless at first. Sarah had proven herself efficient and reliable. On the surface, she did everything right. She managed schedules, communicated with clients, and handled sensitive files. Thomas justified his decision by pointing to her competence, pretending it had nothing to do with their personal relationship. But everyone in the office knew better. Whispers spread quickly. Some staff members began avoiding Sarah altogether, while others pretended to like her out of fear. No one trusted her, and everyone feared crossing her. Sarah, on the other hand, embraced her new role with open arms. She moved with purpose through the halls, no longer the quiet secretary in the background. She started attending executive meetings, offering her opinions with unwarranted confidence. She questioned decisions made by senior staff, even challenging Thomas publicly once or twice. Instead of being reprimanded, she was praised. Thomas, caught between guilt and desire, encouraged her rise without realizing what he was creating, a monster fueled by obsession and entitlement. Her control over him became evident in subtle ways. She had access to his calendar, managed his finances, and knew every detail of his business schedule. She began making calls in his name, speaking to clients directly, and reviewing confidential property contracts. To those outside the company, she appeared to be his partner. To those inside, she was a ticking time bomb no one could defuse. As Sarah's confidence grew, so did her possessiveness. She started questioning where Thomas went after work, checking in late at night, and reviewing his text messages under the pretense of helping him stay organized. She would show up unexpectedly, claiming to be nearby, but always at the worst times. When Thomas hesitated to answer her calls or delayed their meetings, she responded with silence that stretched for hours only to return with passive-aggressive messages and subtle threats disguised as jokes. At home, Elaine continued to play the part of the devoted wife, but her silence was strategic. She no longer asked questions. Instead, she observed, listened, and waited. Her attorney had already drafted the divorce papers, but she didn't file them yet. There was still too much at stake, and she feared that once she moved, everything would spiral out of control. She knew something wasn't right, not just with her husband, but with the woman he had let into their lives. Then came the company gala, a black-tie event celebrating a major acquisition. Thomas arrived with Elaine, but Sarah was already there, wearing a sleek black gown that drew eyes the moment she entered the room. She hovered close to Thomas, excusing herself only when absolutely necessary. She spoke with clients, laughed with investors, and acted as though she belonged. Elaine noticed every move. When Sarah raised a toast to future growth and fearless leadership, her eyes never left Thomas. It was no longer subtle, it was a declaration. Later that evening, Thomas found an envelope on his desk. Inside were printed screenshots of text conversations, his own, with Sarah, explicit and personal. Attached was a single note written in sharp, blocky handwriting. "How long do you think you can keep this up?" There was no name, no return address, nothing to trace. He assumed it was Elaine trying to force a confession. But when he confronted her, she denied everything, and convincingly so. The truth was, the message hadn't come from Elaine. It hadn't come from any known source. Someone else had been watching, someone close enough to gather private information, but distant enough to remain hidden. It became clear that Sarah's growing influence was drawing attention, and not just from Thomas's family. The company's board began to raise concerns. Several partners quietly voiced discomfort over Sarah's presence and involvement in operations. One threatened to pull out of a deal unless Thomas restructured the leadership. Investors became uneasy. Morale inside the office plummeted. But Thomas, unable to separate business from obsession, defended her at every turn. It was a costly decision. Sarah started hinting that she wanted a public role, no more secrecy. She wanted to attend family functions, travel openly, and move in together. Thomas panicked. The fantasy had turned into a demand. He began pulling away, subtly at first, canceling dinners, delaying calls. But Sarah noticed. She always noticed. And she didn't take rejection well. Shortly after, an anonymous email was sent to the board of directors, including photos of Thomas and Sarah together, financial reports showing questionable transfers, and private emails suggesting conflicts of interest. It was a calculated move designed to corner him. Thomas realized he was losing control. Everything he thought he could balance was crashing down. His marriage was hanging by a thread, his company was unraveling, and the woman he had once seen as a distraction now held all the leverage. In his office late one night, he stared at Sarah's empty desk. For the first time, he didn't feel desire or guilt. He felt fear. A deep, quiet fear that he had invited something into his life that he could no longer contain. And somewhere, beneath all the panic and shame, one chilling thought repeated itself in his mind. If this continued, someone was going to get hurt. It was a cold Thursday evening when everything started to fall apart. The sky was overcast, and a heavy wind pressed against the windows of the Reed estate. Elaine had told her assistant she would be working from home that day, but when her assistant called to confirm a client's appointment, there was no answer. Her phone went straight to voicemail. She missed school pickup, something she'd never done. That evening, the house was dark. Neighbors assumed the family was away for the weekend. By Friday morning, the silence became alarming. Elaine's sister, Rachel, who lived 2 states away, received a call from the school asking why no one had picked up the children. Rachel tried calling Elaine and Thomas but received no response. Thinking it was a miscommunication, she contacted the police and requested a welfare check. 2 uniformed officers arrived at the Reed residence late that afternoon. From the outside, nothing seemed unusual. The cars were parked in the garage. The doors were locked. But when they entered the home using a security override code provided by Rachel, something felt off. The air was stale. Elaine's phone was on the kitchen counter. Her purse still hung by the door. The house was spotless, too spotless. No signs of struggle, no broken furniture, no blood. But when one of the officers stepped into the basement to check the wine cellar, they noticed a section of the floor looked recently disturbed. It was subtle, but enough to raise suspicion. Further inspection revealed a patch of floorboards that had been hastily pried up and nailed back down. Beneath them was a tarp. Inside it was the body of Elaine Reed. She had been strangled. There were bruises on her neck, her wrists showed signs of restraint, and her wedding ring was missing. There were no fingerprints on the tarp, no murder weapon in sight. The police immediately sealed off the house and issued a warrant for Thomas's arrest. At the time of the discovery, Thomas was at the office. He was preparing for a board meeting when the police arrived. He was calm at first, assuming they were investigating Sarah's whistleblowing emails. But when they told him Elaine's body had been found in their home, everything changed. He denied knowing anything. He said Elaine had gone to visit her sister. He insisted he hadn't seen her in days. But the evidence told another story. Surveillance footage from a neighbor's camera showed Thomas entering the home late Wednesday night with gloves in his pocket. He was seen loading cleaning supplies into the trunk of his car earlier that day. His fingerprints were found on the floorboards. And worst of all, scratches on his neck matched defensive wounds consistent with a struggle. He was arrested on suspicion of murder. News of the arrest spread quickly. Reporters camped outside the Reed estate. The media dubbed it a CEO love triangle gone deadly. The scandal sent shockwaves through the business community. Investors pulled out of deals. Clients withdrew their contracts. The company's stock plummeted. But amid all the chaos, one detail stood out: Sarah Collins had vanished. She had failed to show up for work that Thursday morning. Her phone was off. Her apartment was empty. Mail piled up at her door. Inside, the apartment was spotless. The bed made, clothes folded, nothing out of place. But there were signs she had left in a hurry: a half-packed suitcase in the closet, a glass of wine still sitting on the counter, and a burner phone wiped clean of data hidden in a drawer. Detectives searched for her relentlessly. Airports, bus stations, known associates, nothing turned up. She had no close family, no paper trail, no digital footprint. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. Back at the station, Thomas maintained his innocence. He claimed someone was framing him, that he had nothing to do with Elaine's death, that Sarah had been growing unstable. He insisted he had tried to end things with her, but she wouldn't let go. He said Sarah had become manipulative, jealous, and unpredictable. Investigators began to consider the possibility that Thomas was telling the truth, at least partially. When they pulled Sarah's company emails and work computer, they found troubling patterns: deleted messages, altered schedules, confidential files accessed without authorization. She had known about Elaine's daily routines, her security codes, and even had a copy of the house key. The most damning piece of evidence came from a recovered voicemail Sarah left on Thomas's office phone. In it, her voice was eerily calm as she said, "If I can't have you, no one will. You said you were going to leave her. Don't make me regret protecting you." That message, combined with her sudden disappearance, painted a new picture. Was it possible that Sarah had killed Elaine in a jealous rage? Was Thomas covering for her, or was he simply caught in a trap she had carefully constructed? Public opinion shifted. Some began to believe Thomas was a pawn in Sarah's deadly game. Others still believed he orchestrated the murder and used Sarah as a scapegoat. But with Sarah missing, there were no clear answers, only theories. The investigation stalled. Without Sarah's testimony or her whereabouts, the case remained open-ended. Thomas remained in custody, charged with manslaughter due to circumstantial evidence and inconsistencies in his statements. And as weeks turned into months, one thing became clear: Sarah Collins had vanished without a trace. The woman who had once been at the center of Thomas's world, the woman who had charmed her way into his life and his business, was now the missing link in a murder case that continued to haunt a city. The courtroom was packed. Reporters filled every bench, their cameras clicking and pens racing across notepads as Thomas Reed, once a celebrated business tycoon, stood trial for the killing of his wife. His tailored suits were replaced with stiff collars and pale skin. He looked thinner, drained by months of legal battles and relentless public scrutiny. The prosecution painted a clear picture: a man driven by greed, lust, and ego, who murdered his wife to begin a new life with his mistress. The evidence was damning. The scratches on his neck, the surveillance footage, the cleaning supplies, the inconsistencies in his alibi. They showed the jury photographs of the crime scene, recounted the timeline leading up to Elaine's disappearance, and introduced witnesses who had seen Thomas and Sarah together at hotels and dinners. The motive, they claimed, was obvious. He wanted freedom. He wanted Sarah, but the defense had its own narrative. They focused not on what Thomas had done, but on what Sarah had planned. They called former co-workers who testified that Sarah had always sought power, always played dangerous games to get close to influential men. A former employer claimed she had a short-lived relationship with a previous boss, one that ended in scandal and silence. Another said she manipulated people around her, thriving on control. The voicemail she left for Thomas was played in full. Her calm, chilling voice echoed through the courtroom. "If I can't have you, no one will." That single sentence shifted the mood. The jury leaned in, even the judge paused. It no longer felt like a simple crime of passion, it felt calculated. Then came the shock no one saw coming. A sealed letter was discovered among Elaine's belongings, written days before her death. In it, she described her fear of Sarah. She wrote about the harassment, the black roses, the feeling of being followed. She never named Sarah directly, but she referenced a woman who had entered their lives like smoke, shapeless, quiet, but suffocating. The letter gave the jury something to consider beyond Thomas's guilt. It introduced the idea that Sarah was not just a mistress, but a predator, a master manipulator who knew how to weaponize trust. Still, Sarah's disappearance remained the biggest mystery of all. She hadn't been seen since the night Elaine's body was discovered. Her face was plastered across news networks, airports, and missing persons bulletins. There were alleged sightings in Canada, Mexico, even South America, but none were confirmed. It was as if she had planned her exit long before the murder. Federal investigators eventually uncovered traces of her digital footprint, burner phones, dummy social media accounts, and financial transactions in cryptocurrencies. They believed she had been preparing for months, possibly years, to vanish without a trace. And she had succeeded. With Sarah unavailable to testify, the prosecution couldn't definitively link her to the crime. And without a murder weapon or forensic evidence tying Thomas directly to the act, the case lost its strength. In the end, the jury found Thomas guilty, but not of murder. He was convicted of involuntary manslaughter and obstruction of justice. He was sentenced to 15 years in state prison, with eligibility for parole after 10. The courtroom buzzed with mixed reactions. Some believed justice had been served. Others thought he was a scapegoat. And still, many whispered about Sarah, where she was, what she had done, and whether she was watching the trial from afar. Months after the verdict, the Reed mansion was sold. The children moved in with their aunt in Vermont. The real estate empire Thomas built was dismantled piece by piece, sold off to pay legal debts and settlement claims. His name, once respected, became a cautionary tale of ambition gone wrong. Yet questions remained unanswered. Did Thomas help Sarah disappear? Did he know more than he admitted? Did Sarah plan to kill Elaine all along, or did things spiral beyond her control? With Sarah missing, no one could say for certain. Years passed, but the case refused to fade. Documentaries were made. Podcasts dissected every detail. Conspiracy theories spread like wildfire, some claiming Sarah was a contract killer, others suggesting she had assumed a new identity. One theory even speculated that she had never existed at all, that she was a fabricated identity used by someone with a hidden past. But the final twist came 5 years after the trial. A hiker in a remote region of Montana stumbled upon a burned-out cabin deep in the woods. Inside, among the ashes, investigators found a charred passport. The name was fake, but the photo matched Sarah Collins. Dental records confirmed it. The autopsy suggested the fire had started deliberately. No foul play was confirmed, but the timing raised suspicion. Had she ended her life? Had someone found her? Or had she faked her death one last time? The case was officially closed, but it left behind scars that never healed. A wife murdered, a husband imprisoned, a company ruined, and a woman whose truth was buried deeper than anyone could reach. In the end, it wasn't just a story of infidelity. It was a story of ambition, manipulation, and obsession. A story where no one truly won. Only victims remained, scattered in the aftermath of a secret affair that had turned fatal.